was the end of the dictatorship, which closed the Black Front and all the other political parties. And it was created by Abdias Nascimento. I'm going to show a picture of him later. And with other activists, and it was very interesting. And I would like to say that both the Brazilian Black Front and the experimental Black theater, they used to have schools to teach Black students, to teach Black, in the case of the Blacks, the theater actors and actresses, and they would like to teach not only how to read and write, but also there was a kind of course like social formation and other ideas that was really interesting to this moment. They created in the Black experimental theater, including a committee to intervene in the Constitution, which was being created in 1945. So they created Congress, National Congress, to put together the Black population, or the Black leaders, and talk about what they would do, what they would create in order to get the struggle against racism stronger and to get better conditions of life to the Black population in Brazil. So they were two of the major Black organizations in Brazil in the first half of the 20th century. So the struggle against racism and the organization of the Black movement were something really common. Coming back to the stories I started telling you, the attempt of creation Black schools or school for Blacks in US became something really common in the late 19th century, right? Starting with the Tuskegee College in Alabama in 1881 on. Many Black colleges were created, Black schools were created all around this country. And in Brazil, it became something really rare, really difficult to find. The exceptions actually are the schools of the Black Front, the experimental Black theater, and other organizations of the Black movement dedicated to social changes, and they tried to create also schools. But it was not a phenomenon. It was not something common as it is here in the US. So,
can we ask questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Were these colleges started by the experimental Black theater and the Brazilian Black Front? Were these colleges or were these?
No, it was school. Like elementary, but with other kinds of stuff. Not only write and read, but there was in the Brazilian Black Front, they used to have this course called social formation. They were trying to understand, to make the Black people understand the importance of the Black contributions to the formation of the Brazilian society. So it was a different aspect of education, but it was elementary because the most part of the Black population, they couldn't read or write in Brazil, and it was the abolition in Brazil was in 1888, so more than 20 years later than here in the US. And it was denied the possibility of being educated to the enslaved people. So only you needed to be free in order to get education, which is really interesting. We see that the first case I showed, and the Pretestato opened the school in 1853, much before the abolition. So there were many Black people who were free and who were trying to get education. So it is something really interesting.
What were the ages of the students in these schools?
It depends on the schools. In the Brazilian Black Front, they opened the schools to young and to adults too. And the Black experimental theater was more focused on adults because it was basic. They were creating a theater, but the Black population, the most part of the Black population could not read, and they couldn't act in the company without being able to read and write. So it was the basic. But they used it to teach citizenship. It was the name of the course. We would say cidadania in Portuguese. Citizenship, I think it's the word. So they were worried with the political formation, the social formation of the black people also, not only word with the ability to write and read. Okay? So be free to ask what you want. And so the other thing I would like to point out today is the circulation of information. How important the circulation of information was not only to the Brazilian black movement in the struggle for education and against racism. It is something really interesting. It's very common in Brazil, the affirmative that the black movement in Brazil was a copy of the black movement, a small-scale copy of the black movement here in the US. And doing my research, I was able to find, of course, many cases of influence from US to the Brazilian black movement, like the Booker T. Washington. He was a huge reference, not only in Brazil, but in the diaspora. I found evidence of he being someone really important to the black movement in South Africa, for example, in the creation of the National Congress, African Congress in South Africa. But he was very important to Brazilians, to black Brazilians, and the idea of creating black schools, black colleges, for sure, was important, for example, for the Black Front, who created and was really created schools and were dedicated to teach black women and men in São Paulo and many other states. Marcus Garvey was another reference, and the periodical, The Negro World, was very important. It was translated into Portuguese, and parts of this newspaper were published by the black newspaper in São Paulo called O Clarim da Alvorada. So the circulation of information was something really real to Brazilians. But this is, everybody knows that because of the power, the economic power, the political power of the US. So everybody sees this flow of ideas and reference from the north to the south. But I found in my research, for example, many articles about racial issues in Brazil during the existence of the Brazilian Black Front. And it's interesting because precisely the period considered by many historians to be the pinnacle of the black press in the United States, between the mid-1930s and 1940s, the Brazilian Black Front was really there, really present in the publications of the black press and two of the most important newspapers, especially the Chicago Defender, which is until today being published, and it was one of the most important newspapers of the black press here in US. So the Brazilian Black Front would be seen by the journalists, by the editors, and by the readers of the Chicago Defender as an inspiration, example to the struggle against racism and to the fight for civil rights, and here in US. You can see, for example, in this edition of September of 1935, this was a building of the Fronte Negra, the Black Brazilian Front, or Brazilian Black Front, in São Paulo. And the subtitle says, the official building of the Fronte Negra in São Paulo, Brazil, where that great organization recently held an intersectional congress. So they used it to be and to pay attention on what was happening in terms of racial relations in Brazil, and they were looking for example, inspiration to the struggle here in US. The best example I could give you is these headlines of the Chicago Defender in the national edition, which is something really important to say. Chicago Defender was a black periodical with national edition every Saturday. They had the daily news in Chicago, but on Saturday it would be the national edition. So it was a big newspaper. And they were telling the public, their readers, how the American blacks were taking cues from Brazil and creating, including an organization like this. I think it's really interesting. The report presented the plans of the North American Black Front for the year of 1936. In the same edition, there was another interesting story. Puerto Ricans organized Black Militant Front, in which the newspaper claimed that the creation of the new organization in Puerto Rico was inspired by the success of the Black Front in Brazil. So it demonstrates how they were looking for experiences, possibilities to the struggle for civil rights, to the struggle against racism, and how they could see the Brazilian Black movement, especially the Brazilian Black Front, which was this big organization with thousands of members, and how it would be an inspiration, an example. I would be talking more about this. It was I just published an article on the book Afro-Latinos in Movement, which will be launched in LASA, in the next Latin American Studies Association, here in New York in May. So in this article, I go further and I show more evidences of what I'm telling you now. Many people asked me, but why they were looking for so much to what was happening in Brazil? And I use it to quote the historian George Andrews from the University of Pittsburgh. And he found the evidences that in terms of statistics, during the first half of the 20th century, Brazil was the more egalitarian of the two countries in terms of race. So the editor of the Chicago Defender, for example, he went to Brazil in 1923, and he met many black important figures of the Brazilian society, like lawyers, engineers, who were producing and contributing to the Brazilian society in prominent positions, and it was really difficult to see here in US in that moment, in the early 20th century, in the late 19th century. So it was different. Looking to the statistical data, George Andrews found out that from 1950s, however, the relation was inverted with the United States. In statistical terms, becoming the United States, a society that was racially more equal, or better put, less unequal between the two. So all the struggle for civil rights, it changed the relation, the comparison between the racial relations here in the US and then there in Brazil. And nevertheless, you see that after the 70s and during the 80s, the inequality in the United States rose again. So it's still a struggle, but Brazil was not more as interesting as it was in the early 20th century to the black movement here in US. So I've been doing a lot of research, and I interviewed 3 persons now. Once, thanks to Melody, she indicated me her former history teacher in the high school, and he was a very nice person. He talked to me a lot, and he gave me 2 textbooks. So, I can't record this. Oh my God. But it's all okay. So the struggle for education here in the US, I've been doing research on this, and I found many interesting things I would like to share with you. And one thing was, for me, doing the research, I was focused in 2 different areas. One was the historical research. So I am actually doing research, especially in 3 archives of 3 black periodicals here. The Chicago Defender, which is one of the biggest and most important, and has the national circulation. The Baltimore Afro-American, which was one of the first, and it's still existent to today. And the New York Amsterdam News, which is the local black newspaper. So I found a lot of the demands of the black movement here in US, a lot of information on the struggle for education, for the changing in curriculum, through the editors, the journalists, the writers in these 3 newspapers. The other front of the research was talking to people and reading the curriculum, the core curriculum of the state of New York. The core curriculum used not only to the elementary, but also to the middle and the high school here in New York. And the teachers, so I've been to Midwood High School and to Bushwick High School, both in Brooklyn, because I'm located in Brooklyn. And I think Brooklyn is a very nice place, so I focused the interviews there. And I interviewed another person. I will talk more about him later. He's a representative, he's a member of the commission I'm gonna tell you, and I'm gonna ask you if you have heard about. So I found out that looking in the sources, the historical source I've been looking since I'm here, I understood that there is a kind of shift from the black history to black people to black history integrated in schools. I found many evidence that in the early 20th century and even in the second half of the 20th century, there was a demand, a strong demand in the black community to the black history to black people. So that in the black schools, they needed to change the curriculum and create a curriculum in which was possible to learn about the black experience and the black contributions for the formation of this society. So it was something really easy to find in many newspapers, like in the Chicago Defender, in articles like that, race must learn more of its history. So it was a preoccupation of knowing more about the history of the black people to empower these people to keep working, to give their contributions to this society. It would be something really important. But when the time goes on, I could find the shift for the demanding to integrate black history, not only for black people, but to the whole society. Which in Brazil was something I could find in the early 20th century sources. So it was a small difference, but I think it's interesting to mention that how from black history to black people to the idea of integrating the black history in the curriculum in public schools in general. And I could find this shift in the Chicago Defender. I quoted this report from 1939. The second is from 1936. So why we should study Negro history. And then in 1968, it was the first evidence I found of this demand of integrating the black history in schools in general, not only to black schools. So there was this activist, Meyer Weinberg, who was a historian and a civil rights activist, who was demanding in Chicago that the black history was integrated in all schools. And looking specifically at the New York Amsterdam News, I found this which I think is emblematic. This report from July 1983, and this assemblyman, this representative, William Boylan, from Brooklyn again, and he created a legislation, he introduced a legislation to make it mandatory, the teaching of black history in all public schools in New York, in the state of New York. He couldn't pass this bill, so he didn't get the necessary support to be able to pass this bill. But it was there, an evidence of an attempt of integrate the black history in the curriculum, the history curriculum, in all public schools here in New York. And it resulted that there is a tangible result of these efforts of the black movement in order to get black history in